It's really my pleasure to welcome you to today's Rebele Symposium. My name is Jay Hamilton, and I'm the director of the Stanford Journalism Program. I also happen to be an economist, and there's a reason why it's called the dismal science, and particularly media economics. If you think about the news from the news industry these days, it's often about things that are dropping, like revenues and jobs and stories. And in fact, over the last week, the Pew Research Center released a study that said between 2006 and 2013, the revenues that support journalism in the US had dropped by about a third in that period, so from $95 billion to $65 billion. And at that same time period, newsroom jobs had dropped by about 17,000. However, there are bright points in the story, and we're going to hear some of those, I think, today. What are some of the bright points in the stories? Pew found that at 500 digital-only media outlets, there are now 5,000 jobs, some of which have gone to our master's students, and we're very thankful about that. If you also look at the revenue sources for journalism today, other, which is not advertising and not subscription, other has gone from 2% to 8%. And what's in that 8% includes things like revenues from live events, which Chris is going to be talking about, venture capital and philanthropy, which we're all in search of, and other types of things that are innovative but are not advertising or subscription. Another bright spot is networks, the idea that maybe we shouldn't expect our information to come from traditional media outlets. Maybe they could be coming from social media. And those of you who are following this on social media, the hashtag is Rebele. And I will explain that in a moment, but it is R-E-B-E-L-E. And today we are really fortunate to have people who have done research on news, networks, and the digital economy. And I'm going to read their titles because I want to make sure that we get that right. So the way this is going to be structured, each of them is going to present for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we're going to go with a discussion from the people formerly known as the audience, which is you. So we're going to actually pull questions from you, and Anita is going to be directing that. The order is going to be, first up is Gina Neff, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington and the author of Venture Labor, Work and the Burden of Risk in Innovative Industries. Next up is going to be C.W. Anderson, who's Assistant Professor of Media Culture at the College of Staten Island and the author of Rebuilding the News, Metropolitan Journalism in the Digital Age. And he's also working on a new project on data journalism, which we might also be talking about. The last presenter is Christine Larson, who's the Rebele First Amendment Fellow in Stanford's Department of Communication. So we're really fortunate that we have Mr. and Mrs. Rebele here today in the front row. Many of you. That's right. So if you're new to Stanford, you might be saying, why are people clapping? And the answer is they have endowed a wonderful internship program that has supported the work of many students who are Stanford students. So if you've had a Rebele internship, could you raise your hand? Well, they're writing on deadline, okay, but I can guarantee. That's right. If you have a media internship down the road and you're a Stanford student, the Rebele internship can fund you. The Rebele internship also funds the work of Chris Larson in part, and Chris is the organizer for this network today, so if you could please join me in thanking Chris. So with that, we're going to go into the world of slides, and Gina Neff.
Thank all of you. Really, it is an honor to be here. This talk comes out of my book, and really the implications of my book. I wrote a book about Web 1.0, and that's ancient history, really, when we're talking about media work. So essentially what I want to do today is ask the questions, what does it mean that we have at our disposal the tools of media production for many professionals, not just people who work expressly in the media industries? When you Google yourself, do you like what you see? You've never done that. This quote kicks off Cool Brand's intake form for their personal branding candidates. Now, for a mere 1,200 euros, Cool Brands will write a story about you, your story. But of course, it's in the third person, and it's preferably about a you who rides horses, has wild international adventures, interesting hobbies, and life-changing travels. Now, people pay for such a service because of a widespread belief that our stories count for something in the workplace, that they're as important for getting and maintaining jobs as our resumes are. Now, today I'd like to talk to you about how we came to a culture of labor that reimagines the professional as a media worker, regardless of the industry they're in. So I'm not talking expressly about great Stanford graduates who will go off and work in the media. I'm talking about all of us, scholars, professionals, technologists. So what I'd like to talk about is how the product that knowledge workers felt that they must sell is themselves. And I'll unpack this relationship between the economic and technological changes that have happened and suggest that what we're seeing is this drive towards narrative that's playing an important political role in shaping the ways we think about work and really reflecting some underlying shifts in American and European economies. But first, my own story, because all of these branding coaches suggest that you start with your own story. Now, you see, these gurus also recommend that for every presentation, you put up a picture of yourself. Now, I want to say that in the era when the World Wide Web enters its 25th year, that this era of the online amateur is over. We see, I argue, an overweening power imbalance in capitalist dynamics, privileging the decision makers, the platform owners, and the policy writers of the technologies that all of us use every day, like hashtag Rebele. At Gina Sue, be sure to mention that on Twitter. So we're privileging these platforms over users and their practices. My talk starts with this assumption that the content that each of us produce for the internet is subsumed quickly and very efficiently into these circuits of economic market power. And so too are these stories that we tell about our work, like I'm also a mom. I put this on Facebook when one of my kids got new glasses. Now, stories about work are really important. For my book, Venture Labor, I listened to the stories that people told about working in the first wave of internet companies in New York City. Now, stories are important because they tell us things that other kinds of data can't tell us. And I listened to people's stories about their work and their career choices. Now, these were the first wave of dot-commers, and I looked at their stories for what they were saying about their jobs could tell us about a larger shift in our relationship to work. And a few things came out of that. First, I would argue that the history of the dot-com bubble that crashed in 1999-2000 is really less about how one particular industry generated this great entrepreneurial fever that we may see being reproduced now. But it's really rather how such moments get shaped by and reflected in the stories we continue to tell. In this way, I argue that stories have a real value for financial markets, and that the stories people were telling about their career really served a powerful function for creating venture labor, for creating these people ready to take risks in these innovative industries. Now, the workers I interviewed had really complex practices around justifying why they were taking and working in startups and taking risky jobs. And I approached this data rather not from saying, are these good risks or bad risks, but taking these risks at face value, really listening to their own stories. Now, financial booms tend to draw people in and keep them there, and they do so through this attraction to risk. Those who work to produce media and culture, and even technology, continually face pressures of trying to figure out the next big thing and position their own choices of work vis-a-vis this language and context of consumer and financial demand. So they're constantly, the people I was interviewing were constantly thinking about who are they as little mini entrepreneurs, even if they weren't company founders, right? They were working in an industry, but they were really trying to figure out how can I position my work here? So from the book, there were these 3 entrepreneurial pressures to figure out market trends, accept uncertain work, and tie their pay to the financial success of the companies and products that they were producing. Now, the first wave internet industry is an edge case here of this kind of work, but I argue that it represents a shift in the nature of employment, and that this embrace of risk is something very real and something that we as scholars need to take seriously. That now the technologies that many of us use to connect to new jobs, to the labor market, to business networking, reflect a set of hyper-entrepreneurial values. In other words, the social media technologies that we're using are supporting this way of viewing ourselves as entrepreneurial workers, as little mini entrepreneurs, where the product and what we're selling is our labor. Now, fast forward to Web 2.0 and the social media self. Alice Marwick has recently published a fabulous book called Status Update about the companies and workers who use social media for new forms of celebrity. Now, she writes that social media sites are teaching their users to be good corporate citizens in this post-industrial, post-union world by harnessing market technologies to boost their attention and visibility. The ideal neoliberal citizen in this world, according to Marwick, is an entrepreneur. So if we model who belongs in this Web 2.0 world, it is that we should all aspire to be some kind of mini entrepreneur. Now, she argues that these social media technologies are really shaping our relations and how we see ourselves. She calls one phrase the edited self, that we're always aware of what we put on social media. I think this is especially true for college students today. And the safe for work self, a highly gendered self that is one that's problematic for all sorts of reasons for racial and gender equality. So the question that I'm asking really is, what does this mean for a kind of cultural capital that can translate into the means of production of jobs, the means of production of labor? So there on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, our stories are part of who we are as people, but also always, already as workers, not mothers, not partners, not sisters, not citizens. We're always our safe for work selves, branded and capturing attention and value, ready to cash in for our next project or startup or book. And I hope you will think about buying mine. Cultural sociologist Tom Streeter in The Net Effect has argued that the ideology of the free market and this empowered individual has found its perfect technology in the internet. That the internet is both tool and symbol for the reproduction of a set of positions and subjectivities in relation to the market. I realize I sound like such a professor. Now, I argue that social media users can be seen in this variety of proto, pseudo, or not quite yet ready to be media professionals. That social media is in capturing this relationship to work, and it incorporates an economic ideology that presumes a set of relationships with the market. Now, our work as media and communication scholars is to start to understand these complexities. And I would argue that it's never been more urgent to take up this kind of questioning of what's going on the internet than it is now. For I argue that the internet as a socio-technical medium has this extraordinary ability, it's unprecedented, to subsume practices and resistance into its economic architecture. Now, we might be focusing on all sorts of interesting problems, and status updates, however frivolous they may seem, I would argue is part of this architecture. They perform a real function in labor markets and in reproducing gendered and racialized subjects for the workplace. So we're doing something when we're doing these status updates. So let's take this picture, for example, for a brief interlude. So, I just put up from Flickr a Creative Commons licensed photo of a woman working at a computer. What's interesting is the metadata becomes a part of the story and the performance of work. That is, the story behind our work becomes part of the narratives that we're selling and get us ready for the market. And it's almost as important as the product themselves. So here's a photo. And what I've pasted on this screen is the story about the photo by the photographer on Flickr. And remember, this is Creative Commons, so this was a free photo to kind of take and free to reuse. But here on your right is the list of places that he has curated where it has been reprinted. And this is only a partial screenshot of the list of links. So the story about telling the story behind the picture is as much about getting his work out there and circulating as possible. Now, what do you think happens? The more links he puts in, the higher the algorithm rates the picture, the higher recognition for his work, the more visible he makes himself as an individual in this very crowded visual marketplace. Now, pervasive stories about work, this is the slide for my the undergraduates in the room. My undergraduates and you all, we feel, professors feel responsibility for our undergraduates. Now, pervasive stories about work in social media really celebrate this kind of entrepreneurial pluck and risk-taking. This quote is from New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. It was actually the headline of a column he wrote. Because, the best way to get a job in the economy these days is to just simply invent it. What's wrong with everyone waiting for a job? Now, I would argue this is the core problem of a rhetoric around storytelling. It draws on a cultural toolkit from technology, from culture, from innovation, and it patches together this mishmash of ideas about risk into a message, especially to young workers, that I think does real damage to workplace policies. So, and this is a comment I think I would love to have a discussion about in our discussion. I'd love to hear from the undergraduates because, Friedman says, we should be preparing college students for reinventing, reimagining, and re-engineering their own work. And I'm sure one of the first messages there is to set up your own professional social media presence to brand and market yourself. So the idea of venture labor, the concept that I've come up with, expands this way that we think about how work becomes the product of our own individual process rather than something that connects us together. Creating a story about being a valuable worker, I would argue, is one such attempt to differentiate what it is that we do, rather than imagining ourselves all as being in the same, young workers imagining themselves as having something in common. They say, no, I'm uniquely and individually different. I have unique and individual stories. As I argue, in venture labor, taking seriously these cultural perceptions about work and these narratives that workers are using to frame their own jobs and job searches leads us to very different political implications, especially about risk and uncertainty. Stories help us imagine what it is to be successful, creative, and in control of one's career. And And in a useful guide to storytelling as a kind of personal manifesto, my University of Washington colleague, Hanson Hossein, counsels people on how to create these stories for themselves. He says, storytelling isn't merely the transmission of a compelling narrative. It's also how we engage with that narrative. Stories help us because we're drowning in data, and they help to differentiate us. And I think we all would agree with that. But perhaps most importantly, Hossein argues, a hard truth of stories is that they bring order to chaos. Stories are narratives. They have narrative arcs. Now, as workers, when we embrace storytelling, we are using, to use William Goldman's famous phrase, only as good as our last picture or book or story or website. We're literally attempting to bring order to chaos to work lives when we create these stories to help explain who we are as workers. Now, in many ways, the workers I studied in the first wave of .com were avatars for the kinds of cultural shifts towards risk that are now well underway in the economy. Those workers represented, magnified, and reflected these changes, and they made risky work seem really cool. And this, to me, seems like bringing coals to Newcastle, to say this in Silicon Valley. That the idea that we should all be embracing risk is something that seems to be in the water. So now, in a labor market saturated with social media, we must address how these stories of individual success and achievement perpetuate a response to the economy that really is helping to keep in place gender and racial and social inequalities. That these stories differentiate us through a false sense of blissful individuality rather than unite us through a common understanding or experience or class positions. Now, our stories, I would argue, have much more potential to unite us and to help us think through these challenges of the workplace if we only learn to read them in a different light. And with that, I thank you.
Right. So thanks to Christine Larson and the Rebeles for having me out here. It's really an honor to be here with all you guys, and Jay Hamilton and Gina Neff. And I also want to thank the weather. Guys are spoiled out here. But thanks to the staff and the faculty also who have made my visit really so pleasant so far. So the question I want to ask today is, how do journalists ground their authority in the digital age? What is it that journalists do that make them special? How does the work of journalism help create a particular kind of occupational authority? And how does this work intersect with larger cultures and belief systems about the meaning and value of journalism and information? And how is that work and that culture changing? These are some of the questions I want to try to get to in my brief talk today. Journalistic authority, I want to argue, arises from the valorization of a historically and sociologically strange form of work. What you all call, in some ways, maybe not these exact words, the work of original reporting. And from a particular vision of who that original reporting is for, which is the public. This combination of reporting plus public interacts in complex ways with the organizational routines of news production. And I want to argue also that the so-called crisis in journalism is as much a crisis of professional self-conception and occupational self-image as it is a technological, economic, or managerial crisis. So why do I pick on, in academic lingo, that was me picking on something. So why do I pick on technological, economic, or managerial discourse? And the reason is, I think, that all too often the so-called crisis in journalism is analyzed within a future of journalism conversation space in terms that are simplified and monocausal. The collapse of the news industry, one, is entirely due to the collapse of journalism's advertising model. That is one particular argument. The collapse of the news industry is entirely due to the transformation of journalism because of technological forces operating outside of journalism on a societal or even civilizational level. Right? You may have heard of this thing called the Gutenberg parentheses. I mean, this is an argument that the entire world of print culture was only a blip in the world of communication, and that we are coming out of it and we are re-engaging in a world of oral culture. I mean, that sees the crisis in journalism as sort of a civilizational transformation. Finally, a third perspective contends that the future of journalism is primarily a managerial failure, the outcome of a so-called innovator's dilemma, in which clueless dinosaurs remain trapped in the tar pits of tradition, outflanked by savvy mammalian entrepreneurs. Obviously, business models, technology, and conservative management strategies all play their role in the story of journalism's decline. But I think this story misses the way that professional self-image and occupational culture intersect with what journalists do and the way that they see technology. Journalism's vision of itself as an occupation, of its technology, and the way it sees its audience, what I call the sticky symbols through which journalists work and think about what they do, play a powerful role in shaping the trajectory of journalism I observed during my research into metropolitan news production. In other words, along with technology and the work that journalists do, we need to consider journalistic culture. And we can understand what journalistic culture is as being embodied in performative acts and material relationships that emerge from but are not reducible to technology and economics. In other words, the way journalists think about themselves has something to do with the technology they use and has something to do with where they get their income, but you can't say it is entirely reducible to either technology or how they get paid. Or so I would argue. So I am going to skip the usual methodological apparatus that accompanies this talk in order to try to make it short. Talks like this, they can go on forever about methodology. We're, as graduate students and as PhDs, we are trained to talk a long time about the methods we used in order to sort of justify our existence and why we ought to be up here talking to you. I'm going to skip most of it. I mean, I will. It is up here, and I will say it is, in short, qualitative research. But qualitative research of a particular kind. It was almost entirely the study of one local news ecosystem, and that local news ecosystem was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That right there, folks, is the old Philadelphia Inquirer building that has now been sold and turned into casinos and condominiums. But I think even though I just studied one news ecosystem, I do think that the work that I've done has broadened to the point where I think it can serve at least as a useful argumentative stand-in for the state of journalism more generally. So, for the sake of time today, I want to zoom back to the big picture and talk about two overarching topics or themes. These are the primary arguments I make in my book on the project, and they're the primary arguments I'm making about this research. But I also am going to tweak them. I'm going to risk something here. I'm going to tweak them, and I'm going to modify the findings slightly for the benefit of my West Coast audience. So here we go. I mean, this is always very risky to do. I think inspired by also Fred Turner, whose work has been a huge thing that I've really thought a lot about. I am going to even use the word Silicon Valley, West Coast. This is something that I don't usually do, but I'm here. Fred's in the room. You all are here, so why not? So the remainder of this is a new talk, more or less, but one that takes my findings in a direction that I do hope is particularly relevant for the people in this room. So I think that one of the underappreciated, or at least one of the more misunderstood topics in news production today is the East Coast, West Coast relationship between cultures of journalism and information, in which particular ways of thinking about the news and the public good are usually thought of as innovative or imperialistic, traditional, hidebound, or democracy enhancing. As you probably noticed, these are code words. They're often terms of abuse. My task here is not really a normative one. There may be normative ideas underneath the surface. You're welcome to try to draw those out, and we can talk about them during the discussion. But I do want to study how these particular cultures, these particular worlds of thinking about information impact what journalists do, and through what journalists do, how they understand the own authority they have in society, right? Way of thinking about information and technology impacts the work that journalists do, which in and of itself changes how journalists feel about themselves as knowledge workers, as people who fundamentally create knowledge for a living. So that's the relationship here. How these cultures of information on the West Coast and cultures of information on the East Coast intersect with and transform each other. Okay, so this is, I can't remember what this is. I think this is Chartbeat. Who here knows what Chartbeat is? Many of you. Okay. One of the main things I discovered when I spent my years poking around newsrooms is that what did journalists think their reporting was for? Who did they think their reporting could benefit? We'll get to the idea of reporting in a second. Journalists believed their reporting was for and benefited what I call the unified or unitary public, the public, not a public, the public. Journalists thought not about the audience or a audience, not really. They thought, when you really pushed them, they thought about the public. And that public, despite all the things that might divide it, was a single thing when it came to news reporting. It was unitary. Now, a major development in journalism the past 5 years has been the explosion of audience data, audience metrics, that tell reporters and editors more than they ever thought they could possibly know about who consumes their reporting and why. This is an example of that right here. I would argue that these developments might have begun in the advertising shops of New York and the Columbia University offices of Paul Lazarsfeld, but that they reached maturity here, really recently, actually. But they reached what is currently their pinnacle right here, with the ability afforded by digital technology to track seemingly every aspect of audience behavior. And I will say, the embrace of these metrics has become de rigueur in any newsroom that considers itself hip to the times or needs to think about money. The battle between those who would embrace the use of these metrics and those who would urge caution in their adoption is often framed around a battle between so-called old and new, or between an economic imperative and a you need to eat your journalistic spinach imperative, right? You need to do good journalism no matter who reads it. That's often the way this conversation is framed. But when we understand that one of journalism's core belief systems for the past century or more has been its belief that it serves a unified public, we can start to understand why, perhaps most importantly, the introduction of metrics into newsrooms causes a profound crisis of belief for journalists. Rather than knowing too much or too little about their audience, news metrics also challenge the journalistic belief that the audience they serve is holistic and unified. Rather than the public being eclipsed or forgotten, as the theorists of public journalism might have believed, I would argue that today there are instead too many publics. Or rather, technology has not changed the nature of the public itself, but it has changed the way journalists understand that public, and this changes journalism. When you have this aggressive display of the various segments of your audience, what they're doing, why they are acting the way they are, every day, when your editor hands you this sheet every morning so you can see how your stories performed the day before. It's not only an economic imperative for you to write a certain way, it fundamentally challenges this idea that the public you serve is holistic and unified. If there are many audiences, and there are endless niches of audiences, what if there is no longer any public and no public good to speak of? This is one of the many things that keep journalists up at night. The second main thing I discovered during my Philadelphia research is that journalists believed their primary duty and their primary job was to engage in what I call original reporting. And I think this relates to the second development emerging from the West that has challenged this older cultural conception of journalism. The tension here lies between a notion of information in which information is seen as scarce, as hidden, and must be uncovered, i.e., original reporting, and a vision of information in which it is seen as abundant, everywhere, easy to find, and needs to be synthesized. And that second viewpoint has never been seen as the most valuable thing that journalists do. Synthesizing, contextualizing, putting things into context, despite the fact that journalists have always done it, it has never been seen as the single most important thing that journalists do. It took a different understanding of information, and one that I would argue is native to computer science and to the West Coast in general, to make the idea that information synthesis is not something that journalists had to do, but something that was considered to be the most important thing they did. That view, the view of information as scarce and hidden, can be said to be embodied in the notion of original reporting, right? That first idea, information is scarce, hidden, needs to be found, that idea is embodied in this bigger idea of original reporting, which is what journalists say they do that makes them important. Journalists need to go out there, find hidden news, and bring it to light. And so the idea that information is not hidden, but plentiful, and the idea that it is everywhere and primarily needs to be synthesized and made sense of, what I call a culture of aggregation, is deeply challenging to journalists' own sense of why they are special. You can see this in many of the battles that have fallen under different names in the past decade or so, right? Is blogging journalism? Thankfully, we're not really talking about that anymore, but that to me was the real underlying argument that was going on there, right? Is this thing that synthesizes stuff already out there, that makes sense of what's already there, right, and draws it into conversation with itself, is that really something journalists do? Or do they engage in the original production of news? And we can also see this with the work that Nate Silver is doing at 538, the work that Vox is doing with Ezra Klein. I mean, all of the big new journalism projects that people are talking about today. You know, Nate Silver in his manifesto basically said, I am not discovering new original information. I am synthesizing already existing information and helping it make sense to you. And that, to me, is a new thing that is a particular cultural idea of what information is, that it's all there, it's all transparent and abundant and all around, and what we have to do is not discover it, it's not hidden, but we have to put it all together and help it make sense. So last, more briefly talk about the new project I'm working on in relation to the stuff I've said already. There's a lot of talk now about data journalism, computational journalism, journalists as computer programmers, journalists as computer scientists, and so on. The idea of data as the cultural notion of what data is has a history that's more than a century old. People have thought about what data is. They have thought about data in different normative and cultural ways for at least since the progressive era and probably before then. One culture of data, and this right here is a map that a reformer, Charles Booth, did of the streets of London. And you can't really see it very well, but this marks poverty, right? This is a London street, and the blue means one thing, and the red means something else. This is a particular idea of data and data visualization. But this was an understanding of data that saw data as reformist. It saw the primary thing that data did as being a way to generate social reform. That's one idea of data. How many of you have ever heard of someone called Phil Meyer or the idea of computer-assisted reporting? Phil Meyer, computer-assisted reporting, that is a second idea of data and the way data should be used in news. And for the sake of time, I won't go into it for very long, but Phil Meyer's idea of the way data would be used in news was a very different idea than this one. For Phil Meyer, the use of data was that, for journalists, was that it would bring journalists closer to being social scientists. It would make journalists more like sociologists. It would make journalists more like political scientists, right? What was the cultural understanding of data that Phil Meyer was deploying? It was data in the service of social science, which is, again, a particular way of thinking about what data is and what it's for. And I would just conclude by saying that I think when we talk about data journalism today, we are not talking about either of those things. We are not talking about data to be used in journalism for the purposes of reform, although that may be underlying it. That's not really the way it's used. We're not really, I would argue, talking about data as social science. We're talking about data as something else. We're not talking about data as plugged into a variable that then gives us an answer with a certain, p-value. We're talking about using data as a way to model the entire world, right? And that's how journalists are increasingly talking about data. Once again, I think what we're seeing here is we are seeing a particular cultural idea of what data is and what it's for emerging, largely driven by the Valley and by the West Coast, that once again is intersecting with journalism in ways that we may not entirely understand. Now, I'm not going to say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing. And we need to understand that it is not necessarily inevitable, and it's not necessarily the way that it always must inevitably be to understand that it's happening. And if we can get a historical understanding of what data is and how it's been used, what original reporting is and how the idea of it has changed, what the public is and the way that our visions of the public are changing in the 21st century, then we can more adequately help journalists ground their occupational authority, see themselves as valuable knowledge workers in the digital age. And I'm happy to talk about this more during questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was fabulous. And thanks to Gina. Both of them have really influenced my work. And so when I talk about what I'm going to talk about, I hope you'll remember a couple of themes. Chris's work has really influenced me in thinking about what journalism is, how we think about our profession and what we do. And Gina's work has really influenced me in thinking about labor in general and how we all promote ourselves as creative workers and what we need to do to make ourselves visible. And I'm hoping that you will hear both of those themes in the research that I'm about to present. As I bring up my PowerPoint, I have a question for you guys. I want a show of hands. Tell me, how many of you have been to see live music in the last, say, 6 months? Wow. That's at least half the room. Now, how many of you have bought a CD in the last 6 months? Oh, 4, 5. Okay. This is very helpful. Get my presenter view here. So, what we've just seen is a live demonstration of a very well-known fact. In the music industry, revenues have recently shifted from this packaged, mass-produced product to, not that, to this, the live performance, which almost all of you have been to recently. Revenues in the music industry in the last 10 years for the mass-produced packaged CD recorded music product dropped 40%, and revenues from live events and ticket sales skyrocketed 300%. Now, everybody knows this. This is old news, right? We all know that it's gone from the packaged product to the live event in music. But what people don't realize is that this is also happening in journalism, where revenues have shifted from this packaged, mass-produced product, in some instances, to this. And what you are looking at right now is a picture of D, All Things Digital. Has anybody heard of this conference? Yeah, a lot of you have. It's very popular. Last year, 650 people attended. They paid over $5,000 a piece. This is a conference that is sponsored by the Wall Street Journal and was started by Walt Mossberg and Kara Swisher, who earlier this year left to start their own venture because they'd already had massive success at the Journal. Sponsorships for D go for $500,000. If you want to sponsor D, you got to pony up $500,000. These numbers have not been lost on the journalism industry. In the last 5 years, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, The Atlantic, and a number of other major journalism organizations have either launched conference and live event divisions or expanded the divisions they already had. And what's very interesting is that this has rapidly become a third leg of the revenue stool. In addition to subscriptions and advertising, Jay in his introduction talked about the other category. Events, live events, conferences are a very important part of that other category. But no one has really analyzed them as an aspect of journalism. So I thought I would do that. And in order to do that, I had to specifically I had to define what these live events are. And I looked at a sort of a subset of live events produced by media companies. I call it live publishing. You might think of it as on-stage magazines, you might think of it as on-stage journalism, but there are these live conferences. They may go for half a day, they may go for 3 days, they may cost $200, they may cost several $1,000s. They have these things in common. They are intended to be revenue generating. That is, they're not newspapers holding a public debate or a candidate debate. That's happened for a long time, but those events were never really meant to be revenue drivers. These are. Secondly, they're considered an editorial product. Newspapers and magazines have always, for a long time, had wine tastings or the Best of Sacramento event sponsored by the Sacramento Bee. Those are organized by the marketing department. These conferences that I'm talking about are designed by editors, and they're considered an editorial product. Journalists in the room will understand what an important distinction that is. These events are expected to abide by editorial ethics. Finally, the events I looked at are a new mode of content production. That is, the 650 people who attend the D conference, that's not the end of what happens. The D conference speakers are videoed, like we're being videoed now. That becomes that goes on the website. It becomes print product. It's not a special advertising section, it's an editorial section. So I looked at events that create editorial product, and I asked some questions about it. So what I did is I interviewed producers at 10 different magazines, which are these, and newspapers: Wall Street Journal, San Jose Mercury News, Forbes, Bloomberg, Financial Times, National Geographic. That was fun. I talked to TED and a couple of other publications that are deep into this conference and live event production. And I asked an important question. I said, is this journalism? And all of them told me, yes, it is journalism. Walt Mossberg said, we consider this journalism on the stage, not on the page. And other producers told me, yes, this is journalism because we break news, because we invite reporters from other organizations to speak with us and to cover our events, because we provide in-depth interviews and analysis, and we have important sources, and because we abide by editorial ethics. So all the producers I spoke with considered this to be a form of journalism. But this provoked some really interesting puzzles. Why is this happening now? And also, why would you go to the Wall Street Journal's technology conference instead of an industry-sponsored conference? Most importantly, why are media companies exercising this convening power in this age of social media and participatory journalism? Some excellent research by some people in the room, including Chris Anderson, suggests that journalistic authority is severely challenged right now. Anybody can be a journalist, right? And journalists in the newsroom, in Philadelphia, for example, are redefining how they think about their authority and their autonomy and their ability to tell the story. So how come journalism organizations are able to draw so much money at this time? So this is what I did. Oh, like Chris said, here's my method slide. So I took a census. I called and emailed the 10 largest newspapers and the 10 largest business magazines. We can talk about why I did business magazines later, to find out if they did live events and to find out if they were expanding their operations. I did interviews with live publishing producers at 10 media organizations, which we already saw, and I went to 2 of these events. and I'm going to tell you what I found out. Those were the publications. So to cut to the chase, my conclusions were that although journalistic authority is challenged indeed, especially in the print and online products, in the case of live publishing, media companies are redeploying very traditional sources of journalistic authority to reconfigure their networks in a way that is proving to be very profitable. And I will unpack that. I know it's a lot of ideas on one little 3x5 card. So let me slow down a bit and tell you, I found out that 5 of the 10 largest newspapers were expanding their conference or live event divisions. And those are America's most prominent newspapers: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, also the San Jose Mercury News, the hometown paper of Silicon Valley. That's pretty significant. Before we go on, we should talk about what do I mean when I'm talking about journalistic authority. So I have a handy quote from Chris Anderson, shown actual size. The power possessed by journalists and journalistic organizations that allows them to present their interpretations of reality as accurate, truthful, and of political importance. Another quick way to say that relates to Gina's presentation, which is storytelling. What gives journalistic authority is the power of journalists to tell the story. How do they position themselves as the rightful, legitimate storytellers of the truth? So there are a number of ways that journalists have for many years asserted their authority to tell the truth. Ownership, we own the press. Freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. Professional expertise, which Chris referred to a little bit, the fact that we know how to uncover and reveal that hidden truth. Access to experts, the president will return our phone calls. Objective, neutral, balanced, we're going to give you the real truth, we're not biased. And the final way that we assert our authority is by saying, we say so. And Barbie Zelizer has done great work about how journalists actually use narrative structures that position them as experts. You may notice that I go back and forth between we and they, and that's because many of you know I've been a journalist for 15 years, but I'm trying just to be an academic. So I may say they instead of we. So at the events that I studied, I'll tell you about these 2 events. One was Dive into Media. This is a spin-off of that All Things Digital event I told you about. This happened at Laguna Niguel down in Southern California at the Ritz-Carlton. And I must tell you, my life as a researcher is so hard. This was the second event that I attended. This is Santa Barbara. This was Economics, a conference produced by a separate division of the Wall Street Journal, not by Walt Mossberg. And this event studies the economy and the environment. And it cost $3,500 to attend. There were 350 people there. And it was a very nice weekend indeed. So it's hard to be a researcher, it is. But what I found was that journalists and journalistic organizations were using exactly the same sources of traditional journalistic authority, but they were using them in a new way, really to assert their authority to convene a large group and to say, you should spend your money on our conference and not on anybody else's. And there are a lot of ways they were doing this, but I'm just going to talk about 2 because we don't have a lot of time. One was the importance of journalistic expertise, and particularly the centrality of the journalistic interview. Michael Schudson has pointed out that interviews have been a mainstay of American journalism since World War I. I was surprised to hear that. I would have thought interviews were always important, but not so much. However, when I asked producers of these events, what differentiates your event from any other industry event, from an energy event, from a technology event, almost all of them said it's because we have journalists interviewing the speakers. We don't have speakers up there giving canned or scripted presentations. They're on stage in a panel, and they're being asked questions by a journalist. In fact, Walt Mossberg told me when he was presenting the whole idea of the D conference to his managing editor, he sold it by saying, look, all of these other technology conferences are not conducted in a journalistic manner. This is a quote. And he said, by a journalistic manner, I mean journalistic interviews. He said, quote, they weren't asking questions that make people uncomfortable. They didn't have the skills to ask questions that people don't want to answer. Now I said to him, Walt, because I call him Walt, how uncomfortable are you really going to make your sources who have come here to be on stage with you, and they're doing you a favor, they're helping you earn money, how tough are you going to be? He said, come down and see. So I did. But first I did some research, and I found that, in fact, there was a lot of coverage of uncomfortable moments at the D conference. The most prominent one that sticks in my memory was Mark Zuckerberg coming to the conference and being asked tough questions about Facebook's privacy policy by Kara Swisher. He broke out in a flop sweat. And this was, I actually saw a video, you could see the stains under his arms. So so I thought, okay, maybe he's got something. So when I attended the Dive into Media conference, I saw a pretty uncomfortable moment where the Intel Media Vice President Eric Huggers, right here, was talking about a new TV that Intel was going to produce that had a camera embedded in it, which meant that the TV could tell who was watching. Was it you? Is it your husband? Is it your 8-year-old kid? And presumably, he didn't say this, but we all know why you would want to do that, to serve up targeted ads, right? Well, Huggers presented this as a feature. He said, well, our new TV really cares about who you are. Yes, you all laugh. I can tell there's journalists in the room. This did not go down well with Walt Mossberg or the other guy on the stage, Peter Kafka. Mossberg said, this will be a caring box? Really? It has a caring chip in there? Huggers tried to stick to his soundbite. He said, let me tell you about the value of a camera. It's social viewing. And Kafka said, no, you switched on me, you switched on Walt. We're talking about the problems of a camera. Huggers said, every device in the audience has a camera. Mossberg said, you can turn those off. We get to choose when those cameras are on or not. It was a pretty heated discussion, and you can tell that he was pretty uncomfortable. Now, this was fun to watch, but what was more important is what the audience told me about that moment later. I said, what was going on there? And people come to this conference again and again. And one guy said, it's one thing to stick to your sound bites if you are doing a demo, but you're not supposed to stick to sound bites when you're on the red chair. So the audience understood the position of the speakers as sources and the position of the journalist as the asker of tough questions, and that, for everyone I talked to, really enhanced the convening power of media organizations. Just quickly, another way that media organizations redeployed traditional sources of authority was in providing access to powerful sources, right? That's something we've always valued. We get to read in the paper what the president said to the reporter. But here, that access is redeployed in a way that may perhaps be troubling. Walt Mossberg said, these events succeed because of the speakers and the networking opportunities. So right now, as networking opportunities, I hope you're thinking of Gina Neff's work, the demand that we always be visible and promoting ourselves. Well, when people come to this event, or to events like it, we literally see the 4 constituents of journalism all sitting literally at the same table. We have advertisers, or in this case, sponsors. We have the speakers, who you can consider the sources. We have the journalists, and we have the audience, all literally at the same table. These are deep dive lunches. Each of these lunches had a topic, a table topic, and a host. 3 of the tables were hosted by journalists, 3 were hosted by speakers themselves, 2 were hosted by sponsors. I found this troubling. No one else did. But what's interesting, when you think about this from a network point of view, what's happening at these events is that journalistic organizations are taking their traditional journalistic network. In a traditional newspaper, say, the media organization is at the hub of a pretty big wheel. It's a hub and spoke network. The media organization serves as a broker. They take information from sources, they broker it to readers. They take attention from the readers, they broker it to advertisers. Everyone has to pass through the central hub of the media organization. But in an era of social media, that is no longer the case because we can find our own information in participatory journalism. Buyers and sellers find each other far more easily now. So journalistic media companies are finding new ways to use that network. I argue that in live events, they're creating something called they're creating structural folds. Organizational theorists Vedras and Stark talk about a structural fold being when a node of a network that belongs to several other networks folds those other networks together. It creates many connections between heretofore unconnected nodes of the network. This is important because it raises really interesting questions. First of all, media companies are making a lot of money this way, but it raises some really important questions. If we're going to consider this a form of journalism, are journalists becoming too cozy with advertisers and with sources? Should journalists be playing the role of matchmaker? Are we creating a two-tiered form of journalism where if you can pay big bucks, you get to meet the sources? And if you can't, you just get the usual mediated product. I think we need to take these questions very seriously. I don't want to end on a terribly cynical note, so I'm going to quickly show you pictures. This is from the Texas Tribune, a nonprofit, which is earning 20% of its revenues from the annual Texas Tribune Festival, which brings in a lot of money. It only costs $100. Many, many people go. It's free to students. Not only is it subsidizing the Texas Tribune's excellent investigative reporting, but it's also creating a new public forum for the discussion of politics in Texas. So it's vibrant discussions that can really serve a new role in democracy if this conference and live events theme plays out in the right way. But in order for that to happen, we have to take this pretty seriously. And we have to say, what are the pros and cons of this new business model, and how can we guide it to the ends that we desire? So thanks, everybody.
Really good project. It's going to be a good dissertation.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We have a few minutes now for your questions, and we hope that you'll join us for the reception afterwards in room 300. But first, your questions, please. Morgan.
I have two questions. Is that okay?
That's okay.
So first for Chris Larson. First for you, and then for Chris Anderson. Okay. So I'm wondering, Chris, if you've done any follow-up work, or maybe considering doing follow-up work, looking at whether or not the kind of tension that you identified that happens in the conference space itself is translated into the print version or to whatever kind of mass consumption version of that event that's given to the public, because I'd be really interested to see if that's highlighted or how that's grappled with.
I think that would be a really great project. I have not done it, and thank you for the idea.
You're welcome. I think that would be really cool. I'm happy to talk more about that.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. And then a question for you. About your discussion about publics, I thought that was obviously very insightful to discuss the idea of breaking up the public into multiple publics, but I could see this kind of, in terms of maybe normative implications, or at least the practical implications, is kind of going in two directions.
Yep.
So first, I can imagine previously ignored groups finally getting the coverage that they need.
Yep.
Maybe it's an ethnic minority, a Spanish language only community, whatever. Okay, so that's one implication. Maybe you've done some research on that. It'd be great if you could speak to that. On the other hand, perhaps when the journalists are getting this, like, charts and graphs of how people are responding to their work, they're changing their behavior such that the quality and the content of what they're reporting is in fact intending to respond, even though it may not in effect respond, but trying to respond to what they think the consumers want, which I think that could be good or that could be really very bad. So I'm curious if you could weigh in on that.
I mean, I think you can see this in a very positive way, right? And the way you can see it is in a positive way, framed, I think, in the most normatively positive frame, is that you can see it as a return to the days of the party press, right? I mean, ultimately, what you can see this as a return to the days where journalists believed in and this was a positive role that they served particular factions of society, right? I mean, they served particular slivers or slices or interest groups, or now we would say demographic groups, previously ignored, constituencies and so on. So I think you can see this as potentially a very, positive development if you want to look at it in that way. But that changes the idea of the democracy that you're serving. And that's really the thing that I think is most important. So again, I try to leave a very light normative footprint and say simply that, this changes how journalists think about what democracy is. And if they're going to do this, they need to be honest with themselves that is what they are doing. I mean, that is what I would say possibly the normative push is there, is to simply, own up to what it is that you're actually doing, right? You can't, places like the New York Times, they try to have it both ways all the time, right? The New York Times has always served a particular interest group. They mostly work for the State Department and live on the Upper West Side. That is the interest group of the New York Times. And the New York Times has forever sort of portrayed itself as not serving that public, but the public, right? And so what I would say is to simply push journalists in the direction of saying, be honest with what it is that you're doing. So that was a way of both answering and not answering your question.
Other question? Yeah.
Gina, I was really interested in what you presented and discussed, especially the ideas that social media encourages the gendered and racialized categories for the marketplace. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the people who don't use social media that way. I see a lot of people who use it as a way of activism or as a way of finding people who, like themselves, don't associate with the gendered norms of the marketplace or culture, and actually that it becomes a space for gathering of alternative voices and marginalized voices traditionally, and a way that they can actually be heard.
Yeah, well, absolutely, those activities and practices are happening on social media, and I don't want to make light of them, but I'm going to answer your question with my own comment on the three talks together. I think, which is what I think I heard across our talks really is what is happening, something is happening in the changing culture of work. And some of these changes are technologically driven, but that one of the things I like across our work is that we think about those translations of technological changes through the mediation or lens of work cultures. And so what's so problematic for the work that Chris Larson is studying is really, what does this do to journalism that journalists are putting themselves in this way? And what's really interesting in terms of this data work, and I really like this direction, is what does it mean that this conception of the public is changing, right? And so for me, I take your points. Absolutely right. Social media is doing a lot of good to connect voices to kinds of production of news and production of content that have never been a part of that before. But my question is, what does this do to the culture of work? What does this mean for the culture of work? So I will just simply flip back and say, many people are taking those that social media presence for interests they have and translating it into building networks that they capitalize into maybe not corporate professional, but other kinds of resources. So I don't wholly think that they're opposite or in contradiction.
Other questions?
Chris, concerning the reporting role
Yep.
you discussed
Yeah.
about synthesizing rather than original
Yeah,
reporting.
yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the preoccupation with hyper-local journalism, where there's a constant interest in putting the journalist in a position of witnessing,
Right.
the time-honored role of witnessing and disclosing what isn't transparent?
Right. Yeah, I do definitely think that hyper-local journalism. So one of the things I say in the longer version of this is that the idea of original reporting is not necessarily a driver. It is a structure around which new forms of journalism have to work. And I think that the idea of hyperlocal journalism is a pushback against the idea of, what do you want to call it? There was a great tweet that said, I'm not sure if I see synthesis and aggregation and context as the same thing. But whether you see them as identical or not, I would say that hyperlocal is a push back against this idea of context and aggregation and curation. Hyperlocal is grounded in original reporting. It's grounded in witnessing. It's grounded in finding new information and bringing it to the public. And I think that, so I guess all I would say is that I think that's absolutely right, and I think that in some ways hyperlocal sits more easily with the journalistic conscience than these other things I'm talking about, right? Because it fits more in the realm of what they have always done. Now the problem, and this is when we start to run into the question of how much economics is driving this, because economics is certainly there, right? It's hard to make money from hyperlocal reporting, and it's much easier to make money if you're the Huffington Post and simply read 40 blog posts before 8 a.m. and turn them into sort of some curated soup that you then sort of put back out into the world, right? So there is an economic component to this as well. But yeah, so I think that hyperlocal is there. I think I would just say that I think it sits more easily with journalists. They like it more because it's more what they see themselves as doing, just on a smaller scale.
Oh, yes, and then we'll go to Fred for the last question. But
Sorry, Fred. Listening to your very interesting presentation, Chris, I kept thinking of Justice Roberts' comments on corruption, particularly the narrow form of corruption that would exist and doesn't exist in his view when money influences politics. I just saw corruption all over your description. Do you see it there too?
Yes, I see some very troubling implications. I think that there's no way that journalists who depend on sources to come and talk in order to sell tickets, like that's way too cozy for me. I see all kinds of problems. But I also do think some of these problems are solvable and that there are strategies. If we just keep thinking that, oh, events don't matter, events are like a side thing to make money, then, which a lot of people do, a lot of people have just dismissed events as marketing things. If we do that, then we will never figure out what strategies we can use to sort of control those.
What are the other sources of corruption? You said all over. You saw corruption all over.
I've seen this as the reimagination of checkbook journalism.
But most of the money is coming from the people are paying these fees.
But you're paying journalists are paying sources.
Yeah. Well, I
Well,
know, but the people are
the
paying
speakers
in order
aren't
to
paying.
network with each other primarily. They pay $6,500 because they want to meet the other movers and shakers.
Right.
And this is sort of an event that's convened because so-and-so is giving a talk. So it's sort of like a mixer. You know, they're sponsored a mixer.
Exactly.
So I think you're right. You're right that there's
And I'm gonna tell you that-
corruption, but I'm trying to put my finger on it. So I need your help because you see it all over.
I have
don't
two quick comments.
I didn't realize the speakers weren't.
The speakers are not paid, which I find very interesting. Neither are the journalists. They do this as part of their.
Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, well, yeah. So this makes this an amazingly cheap form of content production, by the way. But as for the corruption all over, there's a huge danger of the perception of impropriety. And the best case is the Washington Post. I'm sure several of you remember this. About 3 years ago, there was there was a series of salons held at the publisher's house with prominent sources and prominent journalists, and you could pay $250,000 as a sponsor to come and attend these dinners, which were quite small. And this created a huge outcry. The salons were canceled, and the Washington Post changed their editorial policy regarding events. So,
That became almost a kind of lobbying.
yeah.
let me jump in here
Oh,
to
right.
foreclose some speech to allow more. And let Fred have the last question.
Wow, high pressure time. I'll try to frame this. I want to take advantage of the fact that Jay is up there as well.
Very silent.
Hey, Jay.
Hi, Jay.
I should out myself as well. Jay and I have both written on data journalism, and Jay is really leading in that direction. What I wanted to see if I could do was to ask Jay and the panelists to kind of cross one another a little bit. Jay, I think our panelists have been talking about the ways in which new data systems have driven big changes in the institutions, in the ethos, in the culture of journalism and work more generally. I know you have an account of what data can do, in some ways perhaps to reinforce some of the norms of that earlier world. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about how data might work in a world where these are the institutional and cultural conditions. And I'd likewise like to hear the panelists talk a little bit about how, given that these are the conditions, what could data journalists, data-driven journalism, do to preserve some of the values that we hold, even under this very sort of high-intensity change?
Okay, data. Investigative reporters and editors define investigative reporting as telling a story that's original, so that's new reporting, of interest to the community. That's often having a positive spillover on what the community is doing in public policy, that somebody wants to keep secret. That's often the government raising the hassle cost to you. When you tell an investigative story, it's expensive because you don't know if you're going to get a story, and somebody's on the other side trying to block you. And most people remain rationally ignorant about the details of public policy. We'd all like to live in a world where the school board function, but we don't want to read it. So that means that the investigative reporters can't sustain their work. What I think that data journalism can do is two things. It can lower the cost of discovering stories through better use of data. That's on the supply side. And then on the demand side, data can help us personalize the stories and tell them in more engaging ways. And if you can have differentiated stories based on a reader's interest, that will give that person a reason to come back to the site, spend longer, and you can monetize that. So I see data journalism as a way on the supply and demand side to help us get told stories that today aren't told because they're too expensive.
I'm going to answer in two ways. First, from my talk, and second, from my new work, which I didn't talk about. From my talk, I would say we have to think really carefully about how data shapes work. So new forms of data always change the work relationships around and how people imagine their work. So now taking an example of, and reflecting on your question and Jay's comment, I'm going to mention a very prominent piece of data journalism from this week, which is the New York Times release of Medicare pay data of doctors. So my work is on health data. My new work is on health data. And what I've done with a graduate student is write a paper about what people expect and imagine data do. And we call these data valences. So one of the things I find really interesting when we have conversations about data, regardless of the profession, we put on the concept of data very strong expectations of functions in our social lives. So we expect data to do things for us. And those expectations change when we move from context to context. So one of the things that I would say about the coming world of data journalism is we need to remember that data are never neutral. They're always created in a particular context, and they always lose some kind of meaning around that expectation. The doctors who were billing Medicare never expected to have that billing information turned around to be used what they might see as against them. Patients who are Medicare patients never expected to have their own health records compiled in this particular way. Journalists are going to have to navigate these very different expectations and contexts in which data are produced.
Yeah, I mean, I would just sort of build on what Gina said. I mean, there's a lot of, dissertations and books will be written for years, sort of doing the empirical work to see what is happening. I mean, one of the real questions is what kind of data, right? And if data is sort of shorthand for transparent and public data, the question is, will we see more stories on governmental corruption and fewer stories on private industry corruption, where aggregate data is harder to obtain? Will that, there's always been more stories in journalism about public corruption, I think because of the sort of First Amendment inclinations of many reporters. But I do think that it'll be interesting to map and measure whether we are seeing more data-driven stories about public entities rather than than private entities. And and I do think that this question of what kind of data is public that Gina is referring to is incredibly important. I mean, on a much smaller scale, there was a huge argument at the New York Times about whether they were going to put up the school report card rankings in New York and how they were going to be visually displayed, right? And this was also, I think, a big issue in Los Angeles, right? Like, how are we going to present this supposedly public data, that's very controversial within schools themselves, right? So now there was no argument about this at all at the New York Daily News. The New York Daily News put it up. They didn't care, right? I mean, so that then, I mean, we're getting into really interesting cultural questions, right? Like the New York Times agonized about this. They tore out their hair. The Daily News just, stuck it up there. So there's a real interesting question of what kind of data, how is that data used, and is what is considered to be public data. Does that change the type of reporting that's done?
I'll just say briefly, as a journalist, I like to play the devil's advocate, or in this case, I like to point out some of data journalism is a bit of the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah.
Because in some ways we're talking about great new tools, fantastic new tools to surface massive amounts of information. That's great. But it's the same thing journalists have always done.
Which is why it's great to have a book that will historicize the use of data.
We need a book that looks at the history of data journalism.
Thank you.
So
Has
I think
anyone tweeted that yet?
So that's all I have to say.
We are regrettably out of time. Please join me in another round of applause for our